Okay, we're back with part two of our conversation with David Hines, who has written recently a two-part series for the American Conservative magazine about the left's better way of doing, teaching, effecting, organizing, with all the ramifications that has for policy and the culture. At the end of part one, David, you were mentioning the technical training that you thought might benefit conservatism, conservative activists, I guess, organizers. Yeah. What do you mean by that, and what can conservative philanthropy do to help there, if anything?
So here's how leftist protest movements actually work today. You have professional organizers who have, a lot of them jobs at nonprofits, and the nonprofits receive funding from private donors and foundations. And the professional organizers train and mobilize untrained volunteers and grassroots people. So what this is when we talk about philanthropy being involved in organizing, it's not about, building protests or funding specific protests or saying, yeah, I will give you X dollars for event Y. It's about building a lasting infrastructure for grassroots organizing. Because a lasting infrastructure means better skills, better ability to retain them, and movement continuity for the grassroots. The reason this is so important is that, every political movement recedes, every wave ends. And if your movement is based on energy, when that energy dissipates, if there isn't an infrastructure that preserves the lessons learned and preserves a foothold for the next generation, when a new grassroots movement emerges, it has to learn the same lessons all over again. And I think this is why a lot of righty grassroots movements start out very energetic, but in the end mostly fail.
Are you thinking of the Tea Party?
I'm thinking of the Tea Party, as one example, but you can look back and see, other examples of it. One of the things that we tend to really get focused on energy as a driver of change. And you see this kind of on the fringe right a lot, if you read any of that stuff. And it's, it's kind of like a distillation of some of the attitudes that you see. The ideology may be completely different, but the attitudes are kind of exaggerated versions of normal right-wing attitudes. And so what you see is this idea that energy is really important. We're enthusiastic about this politician, or we're enthusiastic about this cause or this organization. One day people aren't going to have that enthusiasm anymore, but that organization or that movement, still has to have some continuity going. And that's how you got, that's how, the civil rights movement happened. It wasn't just one day Martin Luther King walked along. It's the NAACP had literally been going door to door trying to organize people for years. And there were a lot of people who had experience in, the Pullman Porters Union. And, there's you have to lay a lot of footholds and a lot of groundwork so that when a moment arises, you can actually make something of it.
So a funder, perhaps a skeptical one, would ask, how long do you have to wait? Is this a decades-long thing or less or longer?
It can be a decades-long thing. Like just as an example, I'm trying to, let me think for a moment. The NAACP was founded, their predecessor was the National Afro-American Council, right? They were founded 1898. They wanted an anti-lynching bill. They didn't get it. NAACP was founded in 1909. They wanted an anti-lynching bill, and they didn't get it. 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott launches, and you get the Civil Rights Act 9 years later. Okay, this can be, it's a slow process. It can take a really long time to build up the structure that's really necessary for capitalizing on a great political moment when it comes. But the nice thing is you can get a bunch of small successes along the way. The NAACP didn't get the national anti-lynching bill that they were wanting for until, but what happened is that they got so many people involved in things. They got people with a stronger sense of their community. They got people who didn't know where to turn, they were able to network them and plug them into opportunities that worked for them and made their lives better in some small way.
Mhm.
And I think that's one thing that, we kind of lose sight of in the battle of ideas. It's like ideas are important, but you need to help people make a material difference in their own lives, even if it's a small one.
So incrementalism is okay. And by the way, allows you to, can I say, sell the project, the cause to donors.
Yeah. Well, incrementalism is okay, but also it's incrementalism until it's not, right? Like if you look at all of the how every corporation right now seems to be putting diversity and equity and inclusion front and center. That seems to us like it's happening all at once. Well, you can go way back to 30, 40 years and see people starting to talk about some of the ideas that were in this. And it takes a very long time for there to be a broad-based currency in this stuff. And it's not just about the idea being broad, it's about having people who believe in those ideas in positions where they can help you. I mean, the reason that we have labor unions is not just ceaseless organizing work and improvement. It's because people in FDR's organization believed in labor organizing enough to actually pass laws protecting labor unions and establish the NLRB.
Mm-hmm. Is there tension in what I'll call here your argument? You are for institutional memory on which one can build to advance. But I mean, the opening was too much trust in existing institutions on the part of conservatives, if I'm not being unfair and summarizing the thing there. But how does one have institutional memory without institutions?
Well, the thing is, you have to build new institutions, right? The problem that we run into is, we build institutions and then they kind of sit there. An example that's actually a really good example is the Leadership Institute, right? Been around for 40 years almost at this point. They've trained everyone in the conservative movement. Morton Blackwell is, probably the most honest guy in the conservative movement, never took the money and run, always focused on making a difference. But it's been, the Leadership Institute has been around for a really long time. How much of our training is done by the Leadership Institute? Almost all of it. We've got about, I think we've got about 6 organizations that do training for people of one kind or another. And 95% of it practically is the Leadership Institute. And 95% of what they teach people is how to run for office and how to win an election, which is really, really important. But the problem that we have is, if we don't get, you have to get fresh perspectives in, not just from the point of view of people who are running for office, but from the voters who have to deal with, for example, in Los Angeles, most districts, I'm not going to be able to elect a Republican. And, if I did elect a Republican, he's probably going to be a fairly moderate Republican. There's nothing you can do about that. That's just the way voting works. But what makes the left really, really strong out here in Los Angeles is that they have organizations on the ground that can go out and they can hassle their politicians and they can nudge them to achieve certain things or to not do certain things. And sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. But it's an avenue for power that we don't really have, and that's one reason I think we're so disappointed in our politicians.
Mm-hmm. You having used an example on the right there, write about one in the series. You write about an example on the left, Never Again Action. Why don't you just briefly describe how they?
So Never Again Action is a group that is basically what they do is they're an anti-ICE group. They're involved in essentially. Well, what they want to do from a protest standpoint is they want to demonstrate at ICE facilities. They want to oppose ICE. They want to advocate for getting ICE shut down. No immigration and customs enforcement, no more borders, that kind of thing. The reason they're called Never Again Action is that they're a Jewish-oriented group, right? they're specifically trying to recruit and radicalize progressive and liberal Jews. So they're trying to claim moral authority from an actual genocide and redirect that and say, well, if you would oppose the Holocaust, naturally you would want to shut down ICE, right? The reason that I picked Never Again Action is there are basically there are like two ways that are really useful in terms of, if you're trying to figure out how a radical organization works. One way is to catch them infighting with other people in their movement, and the other way is to look at their recruiting documents. Because in both cases, they're very interested in explaining themselves clearly and making sure people understand what they're about. And Never Again Action was all about onboarding new people, and they were about, bringing new people in, as many as possible. So they were really open with their documentation. They posted it all online, and I put in, part 2 of the article about 200 pages of their documentation. A lot of, names and contact information redacted, because this isn't about, organizing is not about specific people. Conservatives who hear about organizing tend to get hung up on individual names like, oh my God, Saul Alinsky, or oh my God, George Soros, or all this kind of thing. And it's not about individual people. What it's about is tool sets. And so, it's not about this person is doing X, it's about here's how this group of people does Y.
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes it a very great example to explain to people how it works.
Yeah. So from the standpoint of a giver, and I guess here I mean a C3 philanthropic foundation giver on the conservative side, what's to be done? Sounds like the specific tactics you'd suggest, or they are tactics, I guess, and not strategies, would be a long-term general operating support, willing to accept incremental, then you fight over what's a acceptable incremental gain. Right. Is that right?
Well, it's not necessarily, so the way to think about it is not necessarily incremental gain, because, it's not like, a big nationwide thing. We tend to think in like, big nationwide wins, right? A lot of it is, so the way that organizing works is you have one target, and your objective is to move that target one notch. They call it spectrum of allies analysis. So if you've got someone who is, an active opponent that is opposed to you and actively fighting you, your job is not to convince them in the marketplace of ideas, right? Your job is to pressure them into being a passive opponent, which is they're opposed to you, but at least they're not fighting you anymore. People who are neutral, you want to move them towards, passive allyship, which is, okay, maybe they're not fighting with you, but they're not neutral. They're on your side. They're leaning towards you. And if you nudge enough people, enough notches over enough time, that's when you get, the opportunities for really big structural wins.
Is this happening in education right now?
It's happening some in education right now, which is good. It's happening on, the local level in school boards. And, it still doesn't come close to, what's going on in terms of teaching people to analyze situations for power and build their own movements. But it's been much more successful than a lot of things that conservatives have done lately. And one of the most important things that we can do now is preserve those lessons for the next grassroots opportunity that arises.
So what are you working on? What are you working on next on this front, as opposed to the international human rights one? But what do you got cooking up next, if anything?
Right now, I'm working on columns and trying to help out where I can. And one of the big things that I think one of the big things that I try to do with the columns is I encourage people to be quiet about specifics. So I will follow my example and be quiet about specifics. But I will say that I think getting involved on the local level is really important, and finding appropriate issues is very important. I think those are things that really need to be worked on.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us, David Hines. We'll look forward to consuming more of your work product as we proceed here. I appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate that. And if there are any donors who are interested in specific ideas of things that they can do that might have an impact, feel free to pass my information along.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.